a guy named Fred Craddock, a preaching professor, who once, when he was a young professor, he and his wife, who hadn't been married very long, they were tired and worn out from teaching and not making much. And so he was offered a little vacation in Gatlinburg, Tennessee. And they got there, and he says one evening they found a quiet little restaurant where they looked forward to just this private meal, just the two of them. It wasn't a fancy place, but it was just the two of them, at a nice little cozy spot in the restaurant. And while they were waiting for their meal, they noticed a distinguished-looking, white-haired gentleman who was kind of working the room. He was going from table to table visiting guests, and Craddock says, I leaned over to my wife, and I said, oh, please, I hope he doesn't come over here. And of course he did. And when he got there, he said, hey, where are you folks from? I said, we're from Oklahoma. He said, oh, splendid state. I hear. I've never been there. But what do you do for a living? And Craddock said, well, I teach homiletics at the graduate seminary at Phillips University. Oh, so you teach preachers, do you? Well, I got a story I want to tell you. And he pulls up a chair. And Craddock said, he groaned inwardly, oh, no, another preacher story. So the man sticks out his hand and shakes his hand and says, my name's Ben. I was born not very far from here, across the mountains, in 1870. My mother was not married. I was born to a single mom, and back in those days, particularly in a small town, when you had no daddy, you were in for a hard time. When I started to school, my classmates they had a name for me, which I won't repeat. It wasn't very nice. When we'd go to town, me and my mom, we felt like people, their gaze would just burn a hole through us. He said, I went to church, but I always arrived late and I would leave early. And one time he said, I guess I was about 12 years old. And he said, I guess that Sunday I wasn't quick enough because the pastor said the benediction before I could get out. And so I was trapped with everybody else going through the back door where you had to walk past the preacher. And he said, I had almost made it out when I felt this heavy hand on my shoulder, and I turned around, and there was the pastor. And he looked down. He was a new pastor. He'd only been there a couple years. He looked down and he said, young man, whose boy are you? Who's your daddy? He said, I felt that old weight come in on me. It was like a black cloud. I thought even the preacher now is going to disapprove of me. And before he said I could even think of what to say, that pastor broke into a big smile and he said, wait a minute. He said, I know who you are. I see the family resemblance. You're a son of God. And with that, he slapped me across the rump and he said, boy, you got a great inheritance. Go and claim it. The old man looked across the table at Fred Craddock and his wife, and he said, that was the most important single sentence ever said to me. And with that, he smiled and shook hands with them and moved on to another table and continued greeting folks in the restaurant. And Fred Craddock says that eventually, before he left the restaurant, he was told that the man that he'd been talking to was Ben Hooper, who had been the governor of Tennessee. You never know.